In the opulence of his fortune, a rich man chained his autistic daughter in the pigsty, among the pigs, in an act of cruel neglect. But the truth, observed by a silent raven, would not remain hidden forever. One day, the raven would act. Morning at the Thorn estate dawned with a brutal contrast. While the first golden sunbeams kissed the mansion's stone towers, revealing shimmering stained glass and meticulously manicured gardens, a dense, foul odor hung over the farthest reaches of the property. There, behind a grove of ancient oak trees, lay the pigsty. It was no ordinary pigsty. It was a robust structure, almost a small fortress of wood and stone, designed to contain, not to shelter. Inside that fetid cubicle, Lirio, Elias Thorne's daughter, stirred in her restless sleep. Her hair, once blonde and bright, was matted and filthy, clinging to her pale face. Her torn and soiled pajamas barely covered her thin body. A heavy chain, fastened to an ankle ring, stretched to a central pillar, allowing her only limited reach within the space shared with the pigs. The floor was a mixture of dirty straw, mud, and excrement. Lirio no longer cried. Resignation had settled in her large, empty eyes, which now opened to the dim light of dawn. The pigs' grunts were her daily symphony, the warmth of their bodies, her only source of comfort on cold nights. High in an oak tree, the raven, who had been observing her for months, shook its head. Its intelligent black eyes registered every detail: the way Lirio cowered, the absence of any sign of affection or hygiene, the indifference of the animals around her who had become her only companions. The raven was not merely an observer, it was a thinking being, and the injustice it witnessed gnawed at its avian soul. In the mansion, Elias Thorne enjoyed his breakfast, seated at the polished mahogany table with silver cutlery and fine porcelain. He read the financial newspaper, sipping aromatic coffee. His figure was imposing, his features marked by austerity and power. His blue eyes, cold as ice, scanned the market news. The fortune he had built was vast, and he guarded it with the same ferocity with which he guarded his secrets. "Any incidents, Alfred?" Elias asked, without looking up from his newspaper, addressing the butler who was serving more coffee. Alfred, a middle-aged man with impeccable posture, replied with the monotonous voice of one who performs a duty without questioning. "No, sir. All in order. Miss Lirio is as usual." Elias nodded, an almost imperceptible movement. "Ensure she has what she needs, the bare minimum. I want no trouble." The word minimum was uttered with a tone that suggested the least possible effort, the boundary of subsistence. To Elias, Lirio was a mistake, a blemish on his impeccable reputation, a burden he refused to acknowledge as his daughter. Her existence was a shameful secret, kept under lock and key, and the pigsty was the perfect solution for her inconvenience. The raven, which had flown to a mansion parapet, observed the scene through an open window. It saw the disdain in Elias's eyes, the indifference in his words. Rage simmered within the small creature. It understood human language, their intentions, their cruelties, and it knew that Elias's minimum was Lirio's silent torture. That day, as Elias Thorne prepared for another day of lucrative business, the raven made a decision. Passive observation had come to an end. The truth, however well guarded, would find its way to light, and it, the raven, would be the messenger. The afternoon sun gilded the leaves of the ancient oaks, but its light did not reach the darkness nestled in the heart of the Thorn estate. The raven, perched on the mansion's parapet, observed the routine with renewed intensity. The decision was made, and now cunning would be its weapon. It watched Elias Thorne leave in his luxury car, the engine purring like a satisfied predator heading to his business. It saw Alfred, the butler, supervise the gardeners with his usual discretion. Elias's world was a well-oiled machine of opulence and secrets, But every machine has its gears, and the raven sought the floor. Its black eyes, more penetrating than any lens, registered every movement, every shadow. It needed a link, something that would connect the misery of the pigsty to the mansion's impeccable facade, and that would be noticed by someone not blinded by loyalty or indifference. The raven's mind, a labyrinth of logic and instinct, devised a plan. As twilight deepened, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange, the raven flew silently towards the pigsty. Lirio was huddled in a corner, her thin body barely visible beneath a pile of dirty straw and a ragged piece of blanket. The air was heavy with the smell of pigs, an odor Lirio no longer noticed, but which the raven perceived acutely. It landed softly on the edge of the structure, its eyes fixed on the girl. Her pajamas, once soft fabric, were now a collection of rags, dirty and torn in several places. The raven noticed a loose piece of fabric, almost detaching from one of her sleeves, near Lirio's shoulder. It was a small but distinctive piece, a faded cotton fragment stained with mud and carrying a pungent mix of dirt and something more subtle, the essence of human neglect. With a delicate and precise movement of its beak, the raven pulled the piece of fabric, detaching it without disturbing Lirio's restless sleep. It held it firmly in its beak, feeling the roughness and dirt against its tongue. This would be the messenger. The raven knew that Elias Thorne expected an important visitor the next morning. A lawyer, Mr. Davies. Known for his impeccable reputation and attention to detail, Alfred had mentioned the appointment that morning, information the raven had stored. This was the link it needed, a stranger with fresh eyes, unclouded by complacency. The next morning dawned with a soft mist covering the estate. The raven waited patiently, hidden among the dense leaves of an oak tree near the mansion's main entrance. Punctually at 9 o'clock, a gleaming black car drove up the long gravel driveway. It was Mr. Davies. The lawyer, a middle-aged man in an impeccable suit and carrying a leather briefcase, parked the vehicle in front of the main door. As Mr. Davies turned off the engine and prepared to exit, the raven acted. With a swift and almost inaudible flight, it descended from the oak, the piece of fabric held firmly in its beak. It landed for an instant on the car's polished hood, dropped the soiled pajama fragment, and with the same swiftness took flight back to its hiding place, observing. Mr. Davies exited the car, adjusting his tie knot. His eyes, accustomed to order and cleanliness, swept over the surroundings. It was then that he noticed a small dark smudge on the hood of his freshly washed car. He frowned, curiosity overriding his haste. He approached, bent down, and picked up the object. His fingers touched the rough, soiled fabric. He lifted it, examining it more closely. It was a piece of clothing, no doubt, but it was stained, torn, and exuded a strange odor, a mixture of earth, something animal, and an indescribable sadness. Mr. Davies felt a chill run down his spine. What was this, and how had it come to be on his car in the middle of Elias Thorne's estate? His eyes, previously focused on the mansion's entrance, now instinctively turned in the direction from which the raven had come, beyond the oak grove, where the peculiar smell seemed stronger. The seed of doubt had been planted. Mr. Davies squeezed the piece of fabric between his fingers, its rough texture and sticky dampness sending a shiver of revulsion through him. The scent, previously just strange, now defined itself as a pungent mixture of animal filth, mold, and something more subtle, almost metallic, which he couldn't identify, but which evoked a sense of abandonment and despair. His blue eyes, usually focused on the precision of legal documents, swept over the imposing facade of the Thorne mansion, then turned towards the oak grove, from where the raven had emerged. There was something there, a disturbing dissonance in the symphony of opulence and order that Elias Thorne so carefully orchestrated. He was a man of logic and facts, a renowned lawyer who had built his career on the meticulous analysis of evidence, and that piece of cloth was evidence. It wasn't mere litter. It was a fragment of children's pajamas, torn and filthy, on an estate where every fallen leaf seemed to have its place. Mr. Davies tucked the fabric into the inner pocket of his jacket, feeling the weight of its strangeness against his chest. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it was beginning to germinate with alarming speed. Alfred, the butler, opened the main door with his usual discretion. "Mr. Davies, Mr. Thorne awaits you in the library." "Thank you, Alfred," Davies replied, his voice a little more strained than usual. As he followed the butler through the silent, richly decorated corridors, his eyes, previously admiring the art and antique furniture, now seemed to search for something, anything that could explain the anomaly in his pocket. He noticed the subtle scent of disinfectant permeating the mansion, a stark contrast to the odor the fabric exuded. In the library, Elias Thorne stood by the fireplace, a glass of brandy in hand, his expression impassive. "Davies, punctual as ever. Have a seat." Mr. Davies sat in the leather armchair, his briefcase on his lap, but his mind was far from the merger contracts he had brought. He felt the piece of fabric in his pocket, an uncomfortable presence, almost a silent accusation. "Mr. Thorne, it's always a pleasure." Elias began to discuss the terms of a complex agreement, but the lawyer found it difficult to concentrate. Every word from Elias, every gesture of his powerful hand, now seemed shrouded in an aura of questioning. The wealth, the calculating coldness, the absence of any human warmth, everything he had once seen as characteristics of a successful businessman now seemed like traits of something darker. The raven outside watched the library window, invisible to the men within. It didn't understand the words, but it sensed the change in atmosphere, the hesitation in Mr. Davies's demeanor. Its intervention had been subtle, but the impact was visible. The truth, like a small fragment of soiled cloth, had been introduced into Elias Thorne's impeccable world and was beginning to corrode its facade. During the meeting, Mr. Davies discreetly tried to probe the environment. "The estate is magnificent, Mr. Thorne. How long has your family owned it?" "Generations," Elias replied emotionlessly. "It's a legacy. But let's return to business, Davies. Time is money." The conversation returned to numbers and clauses, but Mr. Davies couldn't shake the image of the fabric. He wondered if there might be a child on the property, perhaps a grandchild. But the mansion seemed devoid of any sign of child life. The absence of toys, laughter, any trace of innocence was notable. And the smell. The smell of the pigsty, which he had noticed more strongly as he approached the mansion, now seemed to linger in the air, even if almost imperceptibly, to his sharpened senses. At the end of the meeting, Elias Thorne dismissed him with a nod. "Alfred will see you out. I will send the revised documents tomorrow." "Of course, Mr. Thorne," Mr. Davies replied, standing up. He shook Elias's cold hand, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. As Alfred escorted him back to his car, Mr. Davies paused for an instant at the door. "Alfred, is there any child on the property? I noticed a piece of fabric on my car earlier. It looked childish." Alfred, with his imperturbable posture, replied, "No, Mr. Davies, Mr. Thorne has no grandchildren, and the property is maintained with the utmost cleanliness. Perhaps it was carried by the wind." His voice was neutral, but there was a fleeting glint in his eyes, an almost imperceptible tension that Mr. Davies did not miss. The lawyer nodded, but was not convinced. He got into his car, started the engine, and before leaving took the piece of fabric from his pocket. He examined it again under the sunlight. It was no ordinary piece of cloth. It was a silent scream. With cold determination, Mr. Davies drove out of the Thorne estate. He was no detective, but he was a man of law and principles. And something was profoundly wrong there. He could not ignore it. The raven, high in the oak, watched the black car drive away. The first piece had been moved. The truth was on its way. Mr. Davies drove away from the Thorne estate. the car's silence broken only by the soft hum of the engine. The piece of fabric in his pocket seemed to burn against his skin, an ember of dirt and mystery. He tried to organize his thoughts, but the image of Lirio, though he had never seen her, lingered in his mind, invoked by the smell and texture of that pajama scrap. He was a man of law, accustomed to dealing with concrete facts, contracts and clauses. But this was different. It wasn't a matter of commercial law, but of humanity. Alfred's denial, the thinly veiled tension in his voice, Elias Thorne's cold gaze that seemed to hide more than it revealed, all added up to a disturbing dissonance. Upon arriving at his office, an elegant and organized space in the city center, Mr. Davies closed the door and took the fabric from his pocket. He placed it on his polished mahogany desk, under the light of his reading lamp. The faded and torn cotton fragment seemed even more pathetic there, contrasting with the impeccable order of the room. The mud stains, the smell of pig and mold, and that almost metallic tone he now identified as the odor of neglect and despair were unmistakable. He picked up tweezers and a magnifying glass, tools he rarely used in his daily work, and examined the fabric. The fibers were worn, indicating prolonged use. There were small residues of straw and, yes, animal hairs, pig hairs. The evidence was stark. "A child," he murmured to himself, his voice hoarse. "A child living in a pigsty." The idea was so grotesque that he felt a knot in his stomach. Elias Thorne, the untouchable magnate capable of such depravity. Mr. Davies spent the afternoon in his office, not with Thorne's documents, but with his own kind of investigation. He made a few discreet calls, using his vast network of contacts. He started with public records, searching for any mention of Elias Thorne's children. Nothing. Elias was known for his private life, but the total absence of any record of offspring was, in itself, a kind of anomaly. He called an older colleague, a retired lawyer who had known the intricacies of high society for decades. "Arthur, a rather peculiar question. Do you recall Elias Thorne ever having children? Or perhaps a wife he never mentioned?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Elias Thorne? A child? Not that I know of, Davies. He was always a lone wolf, focused on business. There were rumors of a brief marriage many years ago, but nothing that produced heirs. Why do you ask?" "Just a curiosity," Davies replied, feeling frustration grow. The absence of information was as disturbing as its presence. If Elias had a daughter, she was hidden. And if she was hidden, why? As the sun began to set, painting the sky in orange and purple, Mr. Davies leaned back in his chair, the piece of fabric still on his desk. The logic and facts that governed his life were colliding with a dark and unspeakable truth. He knew he couldn't simply hand over that piece of cloth to the police and expect them to act against a man as powerful as Elias Thorne without more proof. It would be professional suicide, and worse, might not help the child. He needed more. He needed visual confirmation, a testimony. But how? Invading Elias Thorne's property was unthinkable for a man of his reputation. His eyes fell upon the contact agenda on his desk. There was a name there, a private detective he trusted, known for his discretion and effectiveness. "Mr. Thorne," Davies whispered to the piece of fabric, "you may be untouchable by the law, but the truth has a way of seeping in." Outside, on a tree branch overlooking Davies's office window, the raven watched. It didn't understand the words, but the man's tense posture, the way he looked at the soiled object on the desk, and the determination that was beginning to harden his features were clear signs. The raven felt a cold satisfaction. The seed had germinated. Elias Thorne's machine, so well-oiled with opulence and secrets, was about to feel its first crack. The raven knew its part wasn't over yet, but the crucial gear had been set in motion. Mr. Davies picked up the phone, the device's weight feeling more significant than usual. His fingers hesitated for a moment over the name Marcus Thorne in his contacts, but he quickly slid to Samuel Miller. Miller was a man of few words, a former police officer with a reputation for discretion and an unshakable ethic, despite operating in the shadows of the law. Davies trusted him implicitly, which was rare. The call was answered on the third ring. "Miller," a gruff, direct voice said. "Samuel, it's Davies. I need a favor, something delicate." Davies tried to keep his voice calm, but the urgency was palpable. "Delicate is my bread and butter, Davies. What do you have?" Miller wasted no time with pleasantries. "It's about Elias Thorne," Davies began, and heard a slight sigh on the other end. "I know he's untouchable, but I have reason to believe there's something profoundly wrong happening on his property, something involving a child." There was a longer pause. "Elias Thorne? Are you serious? That man has more eyes and ears than the government, and a child? That's a serious accusation, Davies." "I know, and I have no concrete proof, just a piece of cloth and an instinct that screams something terrible is happening." Davies described the fabric, the smell, the pig hairs, the absence of records of Thorne's children. He omitted the part about the raven, knowing Miller would consider him mad. "You want me to break into Elias Thorne's property because of a dirty pajama scrap and an instinct?" Miller sounded skeptical, but Davies could sense the professional curiosity behind the disbelief. "Not break in, Samuel. Investigate, surveillance, look for any anomaly, any sign of a presence that shouldn't be there. Anything that can confirm my suspicions. I need something solid before I go to the police, something they can't simply sweep under the rug out of fear of Thorne." Miller pondered. "This is risky, Davies, for me and for you. If Thorne finds out we're sniffing around, he won't hesitate to crush us. I know the risk, and I'm willing to take it. What do you say? Meet me tomorrow morning, my office, at 8. Bring the piece of cloth, and be prepared to give me a good retainer. Elias Thorne isn't a cheap target." "I'll be there," Davies replied, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. The gear had turned. The next day, punctually at 8, Davies was in Miller's modest and cluttered office. The detective, a corpulent man with tired but penetrating eyes, examined the fabric with the same magnifying glass Davies had used. His face remained impassive, but Davies noticed a slight frown. "Pig hairs, organic dirt, and the smell," Miller murmured, handing the fabric back. "It's strong. Neglect, as you said. But a child in a pigsty? That's a level of depravity even Thorne would struggle to hide." "He's a cold man, Samuel, and the absence of records of children is disturbing. If he had an autistic daughter, as rumors suggest, and wanted to hide her from the world, a pigsty would be the perfect place to keep her isolated and out of sight." Miller nodded slowly. "I understand the perverse logic. Okay, Davies, here's the plan. I'll start with external surveillance, property maps, security patterns, employee routines. I'll look for anything out of the ordinary, deliveries of child supplies, a car that shouldn't be there, any movement that suggests an additional presence. I won't get too close at first. Thorne has eyes everywhere." "And if you find nothing?" Davies asked, hope mixed with the fear that his suspicions were unfounded. "Then you'll have to accept that your instinct was wrong, or that Thorne is a master at hiding his secrets. But if I do find something, then we'll have to decide the next step. This could take time, Davies, and patience." Davies nodded. "Time is what we don't have, Samuel. Not if a child is living in those conditions." Miller just looked at him, a silent understanding passing between them. He knew Davies wasn't just seeking justice, but salvation. As Miller began his investigation, setting up his surveillance equipment at a strategic point far from the Thorne estate, The raven watched from high in a pine tree. It saw Miller's car, discreet and dark, park on the dirt road that led to the property, but which wasn't the main entrance. The raven watched Miller set up a camouflaged camera, its movements precise and calculated. The intelligent bird felt a pang of satisfaction. The planted seed had grown. The lawyer, now with the help of a shadow hunter, was drawing closer. The raven knew that truth, like water, always finds a crack to seep through, and it was there to ensure that crack became a fissure. Its mission was far from over, but each piece of the puzzle was slowly and inexorably falling into place, towards Elias Thorne's downfall. The following days dragged on for Mr. Davies in a fog of anxiety and anticipation. Every phone ring made him jump. Every prolonged silence plunged him deeper into a pit of worry. He tried to focus on his work, but the documents on his desk seemed like meaningless blurs. His mind was miles away at Elias Thorne's vast and impenetrable estate, wondering what Samuel Miller might be finding, or more terrifyingly, not finding. Miller, in turn, operated with the cold precision of a surgeon. He had set up his surveillance equipment at strategic points around the perimeter of the Thorne estate. Long-range night vision cameras, directional microphones, and even a discreet drone, programmed for high-altitude reconnaissance flights, became his eyes and ears. Elias Thorne's property was a labyrinth of security. High walls, electrified fences, motion sensors, and a security team that patrolled with military regularity. It was evident that Thorne wanted neither to be disturbed nor seen. In the first few days, Miller found only what he expected, the monotonous routine of a reclusive magnate's mansion. Luxury cars coming and going, gardeners tending to impeccable lawns, deliveries of groceries and mail. Nothing that suggested the presence of a child. The absence was, in itself, proof of Thorne's effectiveness in hiding his secrets, but not a confirmation of Davies's suspicion. "He's good," Miller murmured to himself in his disguised van, watching the images on his monitors. "Very good." Frustration began to set in. Davies called every few hours, his voice increasingly tense. "Anything, Samuel? Anything at all?" "Nothing yet, Davies. The estate is a fortress. He leaves no loose ends. If there's a child there, she's very well hidden." The raven, from its perch in a tall pine, watched Miller with an almost human curiosity. It saw the man with his equipment, his eyes fixed on the screens, and understood the difficulty of the task. The raven knew the truth was there, but the barrier was thick. It flew over the property a few times, a dark speck against the sky, observing the pigsty, the chain, the fragile figure of Aurora. It wanted to guide, but its intelligence didn't extend to such direct communication. It could only observe and hope that the man's persistence would be rewarded. On the night of the fourth day, something changed. Miller was reviewing the night recordings, looking for patterns of light or sound that might have escaped his daytime attention. The main mansion was dark, except for a few security lights. However, in a more remote area of the property, near what the maps indicated was a set of service outbuildings and an old barn, Miller noticed a faint, intermittent light. It wasn't a security light, nor the light from an ordinary window. It seemed to come from below, perhaps from a crack or an opening, and it came from an area he had identified as the pigsty. He zoomed in on the image. The light was almost imperceptible, a yellowish glow that appeared and disappeared, and for a brief moment a sound, a muffled, almost inaudible sound, but which Miller, with his trained hearing, identified as a whimper. Not a pig's grunt. It was sharper, more human. Miller sat upright, his fatigue forgotten. He rewound the recording, playing the moment several times. The light, the sound. It was faint, but it was there. An anomaly. He picked up the phone, dialing Davies' number. It was late, but he knew Davies would be awake. "Samuel, any news?" Davies's voice was hoarse with worry. "I think so, Davies. It's not much, but it's something. Last night I detected a strange light coming from the pigsty area, and a sound, a whimper. It wasn't a pig. There was a heavy silence on the other end of the line, laden with implication. A whimper. Human. Davies's voice was a whisper. I can't be sure. It was very faint. But it wasn't animal. And the light. It doesn't fit the routine. It's a crack, an opening. It suggests there's something or someone in there who shouldn't be. Davies let out a sigh that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. So my suspicions weren't unfounded. No, but it's still not enough to go to the police. They'll want more than a light and a muffled whimper from a night recording. We need visual confirmation. We need to know what's happening in there. And how will we do that? Davies asked. Hope and terror mingled in his voice. I'll have to get closer, much closer than I'd like. I'll have to find a way to get into that area undetected. This is the riskiest part, Davies. If I get caught, Thorne will know someone is sniffing around. I know the risk, Samuel, but we can't stop now. Not after this. Do whatever it takes. Just be careful. I always am, Miller replied, but there was a note of seriousness in his voice that Davies hadn't heard before. He hung up, his eyes returning to the screens. The faint light and distant whimper were the proof he needed to justify the next step. The gear had turned again, and this time it was dangerously approaching the heart of Elias Thorne's secret. From high in the pine tree, the raven watched Miller's van. It didn't hear the conversation, but it sensed the change in the man's posture, the renewed determination. The intelligent bird knew that the crack in Thorne's facade was about to deepen. The truth, as it had always known, was emerging from the shadows, and it was there to ensure no one could ignore it. Miller spent the rest of the night and the following morning immersed in planning. The risk was immense. Infiltrating Elias Thorne's property wasn't just trespassing. It was challenging a man with limitless resources and a network of influence that could crush anyone who dared to cross his path. But the whimper, that faint and unmistakable sound, had ignited a flame of urgency in Miller. He wasn't just a detective. He was a man with a moral code, and the idea of a child living in such conditions was intolerable. He reviewed the property maps, the security guards' patrol routes, the camera's blind spots. He prepared his equipment, a set of high-tech lock-picking tools, state-of-the-art night vision goggles, an encrypted radio communicator, and a small, thumb-sized, high-resolution video camera, camouflaged to look like a rock or a piece of debris. His dark, noiseless clothing was designed to blend into the darkness and allow silent movements. Davies called again at noon, his voice even more tense. "Are you going tonight, Samuel?" "Yes. The new moon is perfect. Total darkness. I'll approach through the woods at the back of the property, where security is a bit more relaxed but still dangerous. The pigsty is near that area. If I can get in and out undetected, we'll have our proof. And if you get caught," Miller hesitated, "then you'll have to deny any knowledge of my operation. I'm a lone wolf, Davies. Always have been." Miller's voice was firm, but Davies could feel the gravity of the situation. "No, if something happens, I won't leave you alone. Just come back with the truth, Samuel. Please." "I'll do my best," Miller promised and hung up. As night fell, a dense, heavy cloak covered the landscape. Miller parked his van several kilometers from the Thorne estate on a little-used secondary road. He exited the vehicle, a dark silhouette against the growing darkness, and moved with the agility of a nocturnal predator. The forest was dense and damp, the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves filling the air. Every step was calculated, every dry branch avoided. He approached the property's perimeter, his night vision goggles transforming the world into ghostly green hues. The motion sensors were the first obstacle. Miller methodically deactivated them, using an electronic device that emitted a subtle electromagnetic pulse. fooling the security systems. He crawled under the electrified fences, feeling the static electricity in the air, a constant reminder of the danger. The security team patrolled in silent vehicles, their headlights sweeping the darkness at regular intervals. Miller hid in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to advance. The raven, from its perch in the pine tree, watched the dark figure move furtively through the forest. It saw Miller deactivate the sensors, crawl under the fences. The bird felt a wild excitement. That man was approaching. He was almost there. The truth was one step away from being revealed. The raven flew silently, staying above Miller, an invisible guide, its black eyes fixed on the pigsty. Miller finally reached the service outbuildings area. The pigsty was an old structure made of wood and bricks, with a rusty zinc roof. The smell was unmistakable, but mingled with it, Miller detected a different, more pungent odor of human neglect. He hid behind a pile of hay, observing the pigsty entrance. A small crack in the wall, from where the yellowish light had emanated, was now visible. He listened, a faint sound, a muffled cry, almost inaudible, coming from within. It wasn't a pig, it was a child. Miller's heart clenched. That sound was the confirmation he needed, the irrefutable proof that Davies was right. Elias Thorne's depravity was real. With adrenaline coursing through his veins, Miller moved towards the heavy pigsty door. It was locked with a rusty padlock. He took out his tools, his nimble fingers working on the mechanism. The metal groaned softly. The crying inside became a little more audible, a child's lament that tore at the soul. Miller felt a lump in his throat. He had to go in. He had to see. The truth was one padlock away. The click of the padlock yielding echoed in the night's silence, and Miller pushed the door, which creaked open, revealing the darkness and horror hidden within. A hot, nauseating blast hit him, a suffocating mixture of animal waste, mold, and something more pungent, an odor of human neglect and despair. The darkness inside was almost total, but his night vision goggles transformed the interior into a ghostly spectrum of greens and greys. The pigsty was larger than it appeared from the outside, with makeshift stalls and a dirt floor covered in dirty straw and mud. Pigs grunted softly in their corners, oblivious to the intrusion. Then he saw her. Huddled in a far corner behind a pile of damp-soiled hay was a small, fragile figure. It was a girl. Her hair, matted and lifeless, covered part of her face, but Miller could see the pale, dirty skin, the large, empty eyes that stared at him with a mixture of fear and strange apathy. She was dressed in rags that barely covered her thin body, and on her ankle a thick metal chain was fastened to a ring on the wall. Miller's heart clenched in a way he had never experienced. It wasn't just the sight of the child, but the utter depravity of the scene. This was Elias Thorne's private hell, and the girl was his prisoner. The whimper he had heard on the recording was real. The muffled cry that had guided him there was hers. He knelt slowly, trying not to make a sound, his eyes fixed on the girl. She didn't move, just watched him, like a cornered animal, but without its ferocity. There was a resignation in her gaze that was more disturbing than any scream. With trembling but steady hands, Miller activated the small video camera. He needed to document every detail, the environment, the chain, the girl's condition. He moved carefully, capturing angles that showed the extent of the horror. The yellowish light he had detected came from a small, almost empty kerosene lamp discarded near the girl, the only source of warmth and light in her dark world. "Hello?" Miller whispered, his voice hoarse. The girl didn't respond. Her lips were cracked, her eyes didn't waver. She seemed to be in a state of shock or perhaps deep dissociation, a defense mechanism against the brutal reality of her existence. Miller felt a cold, intense rage build within him. Elias Thorne was not just a cruel man. He was a monster. The image of that child, chained like an animal, living among pigs, would be Thorne's undoing. He finished recording, ensuring he had irrefutable proof. Every second of that video would be a nail in the coffin of Thorne's empire. He wanted to approach, to offer help, but he knew he couldn't. Not yet. His priority was to get out of there with the evidence and ensure justice was served. The raven, which had flown silently to the pigsty roof, observed the scene through a crack in the rusty zinc. Its black eyes caught Miller's figure, the camera, and the huddled girl. A dark satisfaction filled the bird's small brain. The plan was in motion. The planted seed had germinated, and the truth was about to explode. Miller backed away slowly, the weight of what he had seen crushing his chest. He deactivated the camera, putting it away with the utmost care. The padlock was reattached, the door closed, and he moved back through the property, retracing his steps with the same caution, but with renewed urgency. The motion sensors were reactivated, the fences re-electrified. He was a shadow in the night, but he carried with him the light of a devastating truth. Back in his van, several kilometers away, Miller sat down, cold sweat trickling down his forehead. He picked up the phone, dialing Davies's number, his hands still trembling. "Samuel, are you all right?" Davies's voice was laden with anxiety. "I found her, Davies," Miller said, his voice choked with emotion. "She's alive. It's his daughter, Aurora, but it's worse than we imagined. Much worse." There was a heavy silence on the other end of the line before Davies spoke again, his voice a shocked whisper. "Worse? How?" "Chained. In a pigsty, living with the pigs. I have the proof. I recorded everything." Miller's voice was filled with suppressed fury. "Thorne will pay for this. He will pay for every day she spent in that hell." It didn't hear the words, but it felt the intensity of the emotion emanating from the man. The truth had been captured. The raven knew that Elias Thorne's end was near. Justice, though slow, was finally coming, and it, the raven, had been its herald. Miller hung up the phone, the sound of the final click echoing in the oppressive silence of the van. Cold sweat still trickled down his forehead, and his hands trembled uncontrollably, not from fear, but from a chilling fury that consumed him. The image of Aurora, huddled in the dark corner of the pigsty, chained with those empty, resigned eyes, was seared into his mind. It was a sight he knew he would never forget. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to push the image away, but it persisted. The nauseating smell of the pigsty, the muffled whimper, the chain on her ankle, all merged into a vivid nightmare. Elias Thorne was not just a cruel man. He was a monster, a predator who had devoured his own daughter's innocence. Miller took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. Adrenaline still coursed through his veins, but now it was mixed with an iron determination. He had the proof. The truth was in his hands. Encapsulated in that small video camera. Thorne would pay. He would make Thorne pay. He drove back to the city, the night's darkness slowly giving way to the first grey hues of dawn. The city still slept, but Miller felt more awake than ever. Upon arriving at his discreet apartment, he went straight to his office, a small, functional space filled with high-tech equipment. He connected the camera to a secure computer, transferring the video to several encrypted storage devices. Each copy was a guarantee, an insurance against any attempt by Thorne to suppress the truth. While the video was being processed, Miller called Davies again. It was early, but he knew Davies would be awake, waiting. "Samuel, are you all right?" Davies' voice, though worried, had a tone of urgency. "I am. The video is secure. I'm making copies now," Miller replied, his voice still hoarse with contained emotion. "We need to meet. Now. We can't wait." "I'm on my way. I'll meet you at our usual spot in an hour," Davies said, his voice firm and resolute. Miller nodded even though he knew Davies couldn't see him. Right, 1 hour. He prepared for the meeting, his mind already working on the next steps. An hour later, Miller and Davies sat in a discreet cafe at the back of an old bookstore. The smell of fresh coffee and dusty books filled the air, a surreal contrast to the darkness they both carried. Davies looked exhausted, but his eyes were fixed on Miller, filled with tense anticipation. Miller placed a small, encrypted USB drive on the table. "It's all here, every second. The girl, the chain, the pigsty, it's undeniable." Davies picked up the USB drive, his fingers clenching it tightly. "I trust you, Samuel, but I need to see it." They went to Davies's car, which had a secure laptop. Miller inserted the USB drive and played the video. The silence inside the car was heavy, broken only by the muffled sounds of morning traffic. Davies watched, his face paling with each passing second. His eyes widened at the sight of Aurora's fragile figure, the rags, the chain. A single tear rolled down his face. When the video ended, Davies closed the laptop and turned to Miller, his eyes red but filled with a silent fury. "It's worse than I could have imagined, much worse. That monster, he will pay for this. He will." Miller agreed, his voice low and full of promise. "The question is how? The police can be bought, the courts can be manipulated. Thorn has tentacles everywhere." Davies nodded, wiping his face with his hand. "You're right. We can't go straight to the authorities. We need public exposure, something he can't suppress, something that creates such an outcry that he has nowhere to run." "A journalist?" Miller suggested. "Not just any journalist," Davies replied, his mind already working. "We need someone with unquestionable integrity, someone who cannot be intimidated or bought, someone with the reach to bring down an empire like Thorn's." He paused, his eyes fixed on a distant point. "I know someone. Elena Petrova. She's a renowned investigative journalist, known for her reports on abuses of power and corruption. She has a column in one of the country's largest newspapers and a TV show that reaches millions. She's afraid of no one." Miller considered the idea. Elena Petrova. He had heard of her. A relentless woman with a reputation for exposing the powerful. "She's our best bet. But how do we approach her? Will she believe us?" The video will speak for itself," Davies said with conviction. "I'll contact her. I have a contact who can get us a discreet meeting. I'll tell her we have a story that will shake the country, and when she sees what Thorn did, she won't rest until he's behind bars." The determination in Davies' eyes was palpable. Miller felt a glimmer of hope, a light at the end of the dark tunnel. They had the proof, and now they had a plan. Far away, high in the pine tree overlooking the Thorn estate, the raven watched the sunrise. It didn't understand the complexities of human justice, but it sensed the change in the air. The energy of the previous night, Miller's stealth, the tension hanging over Thorn's house, all pointed to a new beginning. The raven knew its mission was almost complete. The seed of truth had been planted, and now, with the light of the new day, it was ready to blossom and bring down the monster who lived below. The end was near. Davies wasted no time. As soon as Miller left, he called his contact, a former college colleague who now worked as editor-in-chief at an influential newspaper. The conversation was brief and direct. Davies didn't reveal details, only the urgency and magnitude of what he had on hand. "It's about Elias Thorn," he said, his voice low and serious. "And it's something that's going to explode. I need you to get me a meeting with Elena Petrova as quickly as possible and with total discretion." The editor, aware of Davies's reputation and the gravity of his tone, promised to do his best. Elena Petrova was a force of nature, a journalist who wouldn't bend to pressure and who had an unparalleled nose for the truth. Her schedule was always packed, but the mention of Elias Thorn and Davies's insistence were enough to pique her curiosity. Hours later, Davies received a call. Elena Petrova had agreed to a meeting, but with her own conditions. It would be in a neutral location, a podcast recording studio she occasionally used for more sensitive interviews, and only with Davies and his informant. No team, no recorder other than hers, and the promise that if the story wasn't substantial, she wouldn't waste any more of her time. Miller and Davies met again before the meeting, tension hanging between them like a dense fog. "She's relentless, Samuel," Davies warned. "She'll test us. She'll question every detail. We need to be concise and unshakable." Miller nodded, the USB drive with the encrypted video copies weighing in his pocket. "I'm ready. There's nothing she can ask that won't be answered by the truth." The recording room was small and soundproof, with acoustic foam-lined walls and a round table in the center. Elena Petrova was already there when they arrived, seated, with an open laptop and a pen in hand. She was younger than Davies expected, but her penetrating blue eyes radiated sharp intelligence and unquestionable authority. She didn't smile, merely nodded in greeting. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and to the point, "my time is valuable. Davies, you promised me something that would shake the country. I hope you're not exaggerating." Davies felt a chill, but maintained his composure. "I am not, Elena. Samuel here has the proof. It's about Elias Thorne and his daughter, Aurora." Thorne's name made Elena raise an eyebrow, but she showed no further reaction. "Thorne is a big fish. Many have tried, many have failed. What do you have that's different?" Miller, sensing it was his moment, took out the USB drive. "We have the truth, Ms. Petrova, the truth he hid for years." He inserted the USB drive into Elena's laptop, which she had left open, and clicked on the video file. The silence in the room became almost unbearable as the images began to play. Elena, who until then had maintained a professional and detached demeanor, began to change. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of the pigsty. A frown of disapproval formed on her forehead as the camera focused on Aurora. With each second of the video, Elena's expression hardened, disbelief transforming into shock, and shock into a cold, controlled fury. She saw the rags, the dirt, the chain on her ankle, the resignation in the girl's eyes. When the video ended, Elena closed the laptop with a dry click, her eyes, now dark with indignation, fixed on Davies and Miller. This is monstrous," she whispered, her voice low but laden with an intensity that sent a shiver through both men. "Elias Thorne kept his own daughter chained like an animal." "Yes," Miller replied, his voice hoarse, "for years, isolated in inhumane conditions." Elena took a deep breath, running a hand through her hair. "This isn't just a story. It's a crime against humanity, and he will pay for it." She looked at them, a flame lit in her eyes. "Do you have anything else, witnesses, documents, anything that can corroborate this and protect us from his maneuvers?" Davies and Miller exchanged a look. "We have the video, which is irrefutable," Davies said, "and we have our word. But we know Thorne has the power to suppress. That's why we came to you." Eleanor nodded. "He can try to suppress it, but he won't succeed. Not this time." She stood up, her posture now erect, filled with new energy. "I need all the information you can give me about Thorne, about the property, about the girl, every detail. I will verify every source, every angle. But one thing is certain, Elias Thorne is about to have the worst day of his life, and I will be responsible for it." The determination in her voice was a balm to Miller and Davies's souls. The seed planted by the raven was now in the hands of someone who had the power to turn it into a storm. Elias Thorne's downfall was no longer a distant hope. It was an imminent promise. Elena Petrova was not one for empty words. Her final declaration reverberated in the small room, a dark and powerful promise. She sat down again, her pen twirling between her fingers, her blue eyes fixed on Davies and Miller. "All right," she began, her voice now calmer, but with an underlying intensity. The video is the centerpiece, irrefutable. But to bring down someone like Elias Thorne, we need a fortress of facts. Samuel, you worked there. Describe the property. Where is the pigsty in relation to the main house? Are there other employees who might have seen something? How did he manage to keep this a secret for so long? Miller took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. The property is vast and isolated, Miss Petrova. The pigsty is at the back, surrounded by a densely wooded area. It's difficult to see from the main house or the road. Thorne dismissed most of the staff years ago, keeping only a gardener who came once a week and a cleaning service that never went to the back area. I was the only one who had access to certain parts of the property, and even then, the pigsty was a forbidden area for everyone. He said it was for his animals' privacy. He paused, the memory of the cruelty still fresh. He visited Aurora at night, or when he was sure no one was around. The girl, she was invisible to the outside world. Davies interjected, adding context. Thorne has always been reclusive, Elena. His wealth allowed him to create his own small kingdom, where his rules were the only ones that mattered. The absence of Aurora's mother, who passed away many years ago, and the way he always controlled the narrative about his daughter, saying she had health problems and needed special care in an institution, helped keep the secret. Elena scribbled frantically. So there are no direct witnesses besides Samuel and presumably the raven that filmed this? She looked at Miller, a glint of skepticism in her eyes as she mentioned the raven. Miller nodded. The raven is real, Miss Petrova. It was the catalyst. But yes, human witnesses. Not that I know of. Thorne is meticulous in his cruelty. Understood, Elena said, closing her notebook. This means the credibility of the video and of both of you will be mercilessly attacked. Thorne will claim it's a fabrication, a conspiracy. We need to be smarter. She leaned forward, her voice lowering. Here's the initial plan. First, I will verify the video's authenticity with forensic experts. Not that I doubt it, but we need an official report. Second, I will begin to discreetly investigate Elias Thorne and his property records, licenses, anything that can corroborate the existence of the pigsty and his daughter's reclusion. Third, and most importantly, we cannot go public with this in a fragmented way. Thorne has the power to suppress. We need a seismic impact. She looked at them, the seriousness on her face unshakable. I will prepare a full investigative report for the newspaper, with the video as the centerpiece. At the same time, I will prepare a special segment for my TV show. The idea is to launch everything simultaneously: the online newspaper, the print edition, and the TV program. A coordinated attack that he won't have time to react to. Public outrage will be so great that he will have nowhere to run. The police will be forced to act. Davies felt a lump in his throat. What about Aurora's safety? If he knows we're coming, he might. He won't know, Elena interrupted him, her voice firm. Discretion is paramount. No one, absolutely no one, can know what we're doing. Not even my closest colleagues until the last minute. And when the attack is launched, the first thing we'll do is notify the authorities with a court order to rescue the girl. We cannot risk her safety. Miller felt relief course through his body. This was a plan, a real plan, with a chance of success. We're with you, Miss Petrova. Whatever you need from us, we'll do. Elena nodded, a glimpse of something that could have been a smile, but was more an expression of fierce determination crossing her lips. Excellent. This is the biggest story of my career and the most important. Elias Thorne will discover that not all his money can buy the silence of truth. As Davies and Miller left the studio, the weight of responsibility still hung heavy, but now mixed with palpable hope. The machine of justice, propelled by the courage of a journalist, had begun to turn. Far away, high in the pine tree, the raven observed the activity on the Thorne estate. It didn't understand the complex words or intricate plans, but it sensed the change in energy, a growing agitation in the air. The seed it had planted was now rooted, and the wind was beginning to blow, foreshadowing the approaching storm. Vengeance was on its way, and the raven, the silent guardian of truth, awaited its outcome. The end was indeed very near. The following days were a whirlwind of feverish activity and absolute secrecy. Elena Petrova, with tireless energy, coordinated her most trusted team. The video was authenticated by 3 independent forensic experts, whose reports confirmed the absence of manipulation. Meanwhile, a discreet investigative team, under the guise of a rural property survey, collected data on Thorne's vast estate, confirming the existence of the isolated pigsty and the absence of Aurora's records in any health institution or school. Miller and Davies were kept in an information bunker, providing additional details, reviewing drafts, and preparing for the inevitable public scrutiny. The tension was palpable, but Elena's determination was contagious. She shaped the narrative with surgical precision, building an irrefutable case of neglect and cruelty. The launch night arrived with an oppressive quiet. At 8 p.m., the online edition of Elena's newspaper published the main report: Elias Thorne's dark secret, the daughter chained in the pigsty. Simultaneously, the print edition, already distributed, hit newsstands with the same shocking headline. At 8:30 p.m., Elena Petrova's TV show began with a special 30-minute segment, broadcasting the video in full, with sober narration and comments from human rights and autism experts. The impact was seismic. Within minutes, social media exploded. Narco Justice for Aurora and Fawn the Monster became global trending topics. Newsroom and police station phones rang incessantly. The outrage was universal, visceral. People from all walks of life, from anonymous individuals to public figures, expressed horror and fury. At the Thorne mansion, chaos erupted. Elias, who was quietly dining, was alerted by his lawyer, who called him in a panic. Upon seeing the headlines and then the video on the news, his face turned livid. "This is a hoax, a conspiracy. I'll sue every one of them," he roared, throwing the remote control at the television. He tried to call his contacts, his lawyers, his press advisors, but the machine he had built to suppress truths was being crushed by the overwhelming force of public opinion. No one wanted to be associated with him. The scandal was too great. While Thorne struggled in his web of lies, a rescue team, accompanied by police and social workers, headed to the property. The court order, issued based on Eleanor's irrefutable evidence, guaranteed immediate access. Upon arrival, they found the pigsty exactly as the video showed. The scene was even more desolate in person. Aurora, huddled in a corner, looked at the strangers with wide eyes, but without fear, almost with a childlike curiosity. "Aurora," a social worker called, approaching slowly. The girl didn't respond, but her eyes followed every movement. With care and a tenderness that contrasted with the brutality of her captivity, the chain was removed from her ankle. Aurora was wrapped in a clean blanket and led out of the pigsty, into the night's light, into freedom. She didn't resist, seeming to accept the change with the same passivity with which she had accepted her imprisonment. Hours later, Elias Thorne was arrested in his mansion, handcuffed and led away under the curious and condemning gazes of his own employees, who now understood their employer's true nature. His fortune, his power, his influence, all crumbled in a single night. The next day, Miller and Davies watched the news, emotion overflowing. "We did it," Davies whispered, his voice choked. Miller merely nodded, tears streaming down his face. The truth had prevailed. Far away, high in the pine tree, the raven observed the commotion on the property. Police cars, social workers, the movement of unfamiliar people. It saw Aurora being led away, not to the pigsty, but to a vehicle that would take her from there forever. The Raven didn't understand the complexity of human justice, but it felt its mission was accomplished. The seed of its intervention had blossomed into a storm that swept away the darkness. It let out a long, satisfied caw, a sound that was lost in the wind, a silent echo of the vengeance it had orchestrated. Elias Thorne's downfall was a fact, and Aurora's freedom a reality. The end indeed had arrived.